Today I'm going to talk to you about the Vietnamese minority in France. France was the first Western country to where Vietnamese migrants settled due to the colonization of Vietnam by France. French colonialism in Vietnam lasted more than 6 decades. By the late 1880s, France controlled Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which collectively is called French Indochina. Despite continued French missions, trade, and military assistance to Vietnam throughout the rest of the 18th and 19th century, Vietnam did not become a colony of France until the China campaign in the late 1850s. The Vietnamese migration consisted of a mere trickle of mostly diplomats at that time. But during the colonial period, there was a significant representation of Vietnamese students in France, which largely consisted of members from the elite class and royal household. Professional and blue-collar workers also migrated from Vietnam during this period. Some even settled permanently in France. In the late 1940s, France struggled to control its Asian colonies, leading to the First Indochina War. After the defeat of the French by the Viet Minh, the French withdrew from the region. The Geneva Accords, issued in 1954, divided Vietnam into northern and southern halves, ruled by separate regimes. The communist Viet Minh forces, led by Ho Chi Minh, controlled North Vietnam. The United States, dedicated to containing the spread of communist regimes, supported the South Vietnamese government. Following the division of the country, the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh had by 1959 begun a large-scale insurgency in the south that marked the opening of the Second Indochina War. By August 1964, the US government believed that escalation of its presence in Vietnam was the only solution to stop communism from spreading. The Vietnam War, known in Vietnam as the American War, continued across the country for the next 10 years, killing and displacing millions of people throughout the region. After the end of the Vietnam War and the withdrawal of the United States, China invaded Vietnam in 1979, launching the Sino-Vietnamese War, a brief border conflict, and aggravating the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis. The Sino-Vietnamese War led to the mass exodus of Vietnamese in 1978 and 1979 on poorly constructed boats, giving rise to the term boat people. The huge volumes of refugees spurred UNHCR to create the Orderly Departure Program, ODP, which organized the process of resettling Vietnamese and other displaced populations in the region in need of humanitarian aid. Many of these people eventually end up in the United States or Europe. In Europe, many went towards France because of the connection this country has to Vietnam. Early Vietnamese refugees who settled in France largely consisted of professionals who made up the middle class and elite in South Vietnam, along with those with high level of education and those with family already present in the country. Larger waves of refugees later included South Vietnamese from different social standings, although their average level of education and affluence was still higher than their peers, who settled in North America, Australia, and the rest of Europe. France received the third highest number of refugees from Vietnam after the United States and Australia, between 1975 and 1990. By the beginnings of the 1990s, refugees had accounted for slightly over 3/4 of the Vietnamese population in France. Vietnamese refugees who arrived in France largely had the intent to request asylum in the country, unlike their counterparts who migrated to other Western countries. The last of Vietnamese refugees arrived in the mid-1990s, when the remaining refugee camps closed. Well, now it is more clear why there are so many Vietnamese people in France. Most Vietnamese people in France live in Paris and the surrounding Île-de-France area, but a sizable number also reside in Marseille, Lyon, and Toulouse. Earlier Vietnamese migrants also settled in cities like Lille and Bordeaux. The Vietnamese have not formed any distinct enclaves within the cities of France, although there are several Vietnamese shops and cultural institutions. One of these institutions is the General Association of Vietnamese Students in Paris. It is a non-profit association founded in 1964, which works to preserve Vietnamese culture, especially among the younger generation, and defend human rights and democracy in Vietnam. The AGVP is now one of the leading organizations of the Vietnamese community in Paris. The association is led by a team composed of young and dynamic people, who organize sport, cultural and artistic events. The association is also open to French with an interest in Vietnam or Asia in general. France remains strongly committed to Vietnam in terms of development assistance as the second biggest bilateral donor to Vietnam after Japan. Financial cooperation is equally strong. Vietnam is the third biggest beneficiary of French funding, including high-profile projects such as Line 3 of the Hanoi Metro. Until only recently, France was also the leading Western investor in Vietnam, in terms of both investment flows and stock. France is now the second largest European investor in Vietnam, and the 15th in the world. Almost two-thirds of French investment is targeted on the service sector, one-fifth on industry, 7% on agriculture, and 5% on distribution. Some 300 French businesses currently operate in Vietnam in the forms of joint ventures, companies, or representative offices. Vietnam and France have regularly exchanged high-level delegations and maintained their mechanism for strategic dialogue on external and defense issues, as well as their mechanism for political consultancy on bilateral missions. For instance, the France-Vietnam Economic and Financial Cooperation Forum drew the participation of many financial institutions and businesses from the two countries. Vietnam is one of the few countries to receive France's three financial assistance channels: official development assistance, ODA, preferential loans from the French Development Agency, AFD, and soft loans from the Priority Solidarity Fund, FSP. Vietnam is now the seventh largest recipient of French ODA. So far, Vietnam has been granted 1.2 billion euros through more than 210 projects. The political relations between Vietnam and France have experienced fruitful developments through regular exchange and visits from delegations at all levels. The two countries agreed to build and fortify their relationships under the motto of traditional friendship, long-term, trusting, and comprehensive cooperation in the 21st century. Bilateral strategic and security dialogues have been established and come into effect. Despite all these bilateral agreements and the high rate of integration among the Vietnamese, they rarely follow French politics. They have low participation rates in local and national elections. The generation of refugees from the Vietnam War usually became French citizens for economic rather than political reasons. While they don't follow French politics, they do follow Vietnamese politics closely and have played a pivotal role in the past. The Vietnamese community in France is divided into two opposing camps: those supporting the communist Hanoi government and those who are anti-communist. Almost all organizations in the community, including religious or commercial, fall into one of these two camps. The division in the community has been present since the 1950s, when Vietnamese students and workers in France supported and praised the Vietnamese policies back home, while Vietnamese loyal to the colonial government and fled to France were largely anti-communist. This political raft remained minor until the fall of Saigon in 1975, when anti-communist refugees from South Vietnam arrived and established community networks and institutions. Today, Vietnamese in France are divided between these two camps. You have the one supporting the Hanoi government, and they self-identify as the immigrants, and those who are anti-communist and self-identify as refugees. The two camps have contradictory political goals, and members of one group rarely interact with the members of others. Now, I have said a few words about the Vietnamese people in France, and I do hope that you have been a bit more informed. And thank you for listening.